So I talked to a lot of designers in Japan. So they have very, pride in their work. So they want to make their design perfect before shipping or even to showing to their colleagues.
Right. So for example, at Figma, when you open a file, you don't know who made what.
That's true.
Right. And the reason behind it is it's just the design, right? It's not somebody's design. Like you're a team working on it together. I think with product designers, I think that with product design, it's not about the designer at all. You shouldn't be able to look at a product and see an artist, right? It's really about the best products. Even at Figma, we have a philosophy where it shouldn't be so obvious when, our interface is, there. It's because otherwise it'll get in your way because you're doing your own work.
Right.
If there's this Figma brand coming in all the time.
Like distraction.
Yeah, it's very distracting, yeah.
So Yuki Yamashita-san, welcome to Pivot.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so you're a Chief Product Officer of Figma. We use it, but it's like a design collaboration tool. Can you elaborate what Figma is to our audience?
Yeah, so Figma started as a tool for designers, and we really thought about kind of how to make design as collaborative as possible on the web. And over time, we've become a platform for product development.
Right.
So how do you go from an idea to the final product? And so we have some tools for ideation like FigJam, and then you can turn them into designs and prototypes in Figma Design. And then with dev mode, how do you hand that off to developers and turn the design into code? So that's how we think about our platform.
Okay, so today's topic will be about modern design.
Yeah.
And before that, could you introduce yourself to our audience? So
Sure.
You're originally from Japan?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah, so I spent half my childhood in Tokyo.
Tokyo,
here.
okay.
And then the other half in other parts of Asia, like Singapore and the Philippines. Yeah, and then went to the U.S. for college, and then from there ended up working in tech. Yeah.
So you joined Microsoft, Google, Uber, and then to Figma.
Right. That's
Okay.
right. Yeah.
So first of all, could you kind of define what design is?
Well, I think at the highest level, design is problem solving. Right? It's saying, okay, users have this problem. How do we come up with the best solution? And I think a lot of design is about pushing for what's possible. One of the biggest questions that designers like to ask is, what if? What if this doesn't have to be this way, or there is a better way? So I think that's at the highest level what design is. And I think that's different from what people say design is, which is just, making something look beautiful.
Or like graphics or...
Yeah. And that's important too, but at the end of the day, it has to solve a problem really well. Yeah. And I think it's about solving a problem functionally, but also in the process, making someone feel something, And so, when you're using products, for example, like the emotions you have are also important.
Right.
But most important is how elegantly are you solving the problem? Yeah.
I like your definition, but do you think your definition will change because we're in the age of AI and generative AI? Do you think that will change?
Yeah. Well, I think this definition is even more important. In the age of AI, because in the age of AI, I think there are many aspects of design that people think traditionally become more accessible. Right? It becomes easier to make something look interesting or beautiful. But that's not all it is. And at the end of the day, if what design is solving people's problems, then I don't think the human element becomes even more important. Yeah.
So just to go dive deeper, I have a slide.
Sure.
So this is created with Figma.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. This was more talking about this is a talk that I gave a few years ago, and we're talking about kind of like misconceptions around design. And this idea, for example, that, people think that this is the perfect process for getting something done, right? But the reality is that it's just a mess.
It's all mixed up in
this. Or, people think that the correct thing to do is to define a problem and then come up with a solution. But actually, most people have some kind of intuition for the idea. And then they're like, oh, wait, what's the problem?
Yeah. We have the solution first.
Yes. And I think, I think we're kind of taught that that's wrong. And it's definitely important to define the problem, right? But I think it's trying to say, hey, like actually the creative process, the design process is not always linear. It's not always one template, and it's okay. So that's kind of like the first thing. I think the other thing I really wanted to talk about was the fact that, one of the ways that design is changing is it used to be this very clean process of, okay, I define something, and then I hand it off, and then go back and iterate. But, right now it's like every day your product is allowed to change. So for example, at Figma, if we got feedback today that people are not excited about something, tomorrow we can change the product, right? And so in that world, even your product is a work in progress. And one of the things that we learned, and it's been a while ago, but for example, right, like in the past, if you wanted to change the car dashboard, it would have taken years.
Right.
It's too late.
Too late. Yeah.
But if you go to a Tesla, they can just ship a change tomorrow, right?
Like updating the
So you have like more dynamic UI. And I think that happened when in the document world too, where I used to work at for example at Uber or YouTube, where I realized that with Google Docs I can share early, and I can just say, hey, here's my work in progress strategy doc, and then right after I share, a minute later I can still edit it and make changes, and so that encourages me to share earlier, right?
So it doesn't have to be perfect, but you just have to share it.
Yeah, and then it's shared earlier. People can keep iterating on it, and I think that's what's happening in design as well. You can bring people into the process earlier, and by bringing people into the process earlier, then you can actually kind of like get better ideas, and it's more efficient because you hear people's feedback earlier. Yeah.
So I talked to a lot of designers in Japan. So they have very pride in their work, so they want to make their design perfect before shipping, or even to showing to their colleagues.
Right.
Do you think designers should also change their mindset?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to not be as precious. And so, for example, at Figma, when you open a file, you don't know who made what.
That's true.
Right. And of course, you can go into version history and see what happened, but most people don't do that. And the reason behind it is like, it's just the design, right? It's not somebody's design. Like you're a team working on it together. And so if more and more people think about it as, oh, we're solving it together, then I think it'll be easier to kind of have this mindset and make it more open. Yeah.
That's an interesting point, because I use Figma, but I was wondering why there's like no name on the files. So there's like the concept or the philosophy of a team working together. So it's not who or
Right. Because when I worked at YouTube at Google, this was before Figma existed. People used to have like a Google Drive or a Dropbox, and you say, oh, like Ryan's designs, and you go in there and you see who made what, right? And it was a little bit of a competition, who's better. And I think at the end of the day, like it doesn't actually matter what designs get made. Like you're all trying to solve a problem for your users in the business. So I think it actually is a better attitude to have to make it more of a team sport.
But Yuki, as a designer, do you have any like feelings? Do you want to stand out, or you want to compete, or
Right. I mean, I think that like there's always a way in which designers always have that energy, right? Of like you want to impress someone or come up with something original. And I think that energy is important, but you need to apply it in the right way. So sometimes, if you apply it to just the look and feel, that's actually might not be a good thing, because if you're building a product, you want it to feel kind of like one experience. One of the things that can happen is, for example, I think it was Larry Page who first said this at Google, which is like, don't ship your org chart. Right? And the meaning is, when a user looks at your product, it shouldn't be obvious, oh, this is team A, team B, team C,
It doesn't really matter to
right, because the user doesn't care, right? It's one experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was kind of like a thing he's talked about a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, that's, if you become too original in like look and feel, then it creates a fragmented experience, mm-hmm. right? Where users feel one way in this part of the user journey, and they start to see the gaps. So I think for that reason, it's not necessarily a good thing to apply originality to some aspects. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to solving a problem and saying, can I solve it better? Or can I come up with a solution that solves more problems? I think that's where the originality, the creativity should be applied. Yeah.
Do you think your philosophy or definition applies to like product designers or even to designers like in terms of like art?
It's hard to say. I'm definitely not an artist, so it's hard to say. And I think with art there's maybe a different objective. I think with product designers, I think that like with product design, it's not about the designer at all. You shouldn't be able to look at a product and see an artist, right? It's really about the best products. Even at Figma, we have a philosophy where it shouldn't be so obvious when our interface is there. It's like, because otherwise it'll get in your way because you're doing your own work.
Right.
If there's this Figma brand coming in all the time,
it'll like distraction.
Yeah, it's very distracting. Yeah. And some of the best products, you kind of feel it's so natural and intuitive that it just kind of disappears. And I think those are maybe the best kind of products.
So you had worked at Uber. So how's Uber doing their designs?
I think, with Uber, one of the things that happened early on in the process was we had, in the early days, it was very, a little bit more siloed. Like when I first was working on the Uber app, our CEO, Travis Kalanick, told me once to take no more than 7 people, go to a different building, and just come back when you figure it out. And that was his feedback to me when he felt like I was taking too much time responding to everyone's feedback, and that was kind of the attitude at the time. And then, like a lot of things happen at Uber, and as part of the cultural change, there's a push to, how do we actually build in a more collaborative and open way? And that was when we actually went to look for a tool that would help us do that. And that's when we found Figma back in 2017. And so, Uber ended up being one of Figma's earliest customers.
So going back to your definition about design, so it's not just about like making like pretty things, but like defining and solving a problem. But could you show us how the steps will be of like defining and solving a problem? Like, do you have any examples or?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that like the way I think about it is, usually you're talking to the user in some way, or maybe you're using the product yourself, and that's how you start to build an intuition, right? But one of the things I think is really important is to keep asking why. So for example, a customer might say, hey, I want this feature in the Uber app or in Figma. And so one product team could say, okay, let's just build it and prioritize, right? But I think more important is you ask, okay, why are they asking for that feature? Well, because they have this problem. And once we understand the problem, maybe there's a better feature or a better solution, right? But you ask why one more time and you say, well, why do they have that problem in the first place? And maybe there's something about the setup or the environment or something assumption that's creating the problem in the first place. So then you might actually like solve that first. So, I think it was actually Toyota that had like the 5 whys. So it's kind of similar concept. Which is to keep saying why one more time. And I think the best product people are asking that to get to the ground level truth. And so that's kind of how you start to understand a little bit more and have confidence in what you're building.
So asking why, I think it applies to not just designers, but to engineers, like HR, even HR. So what's different about asking why in terms of design?
I think that maybe I have a more expansive view of design, which is I think that this kind of design thinking is something that you can apply to non-visual things too.
I see.
I think it's kind of business leaders should always ask more why, questions around why or what if, and these are all good questions to ask. But maybe the methodology is not typically how they go about it.
So when you ask questions, do you do it by yourself or do you talk to the customers or do you hold a brainstorm meeting with a bunch of colleagues? How do you do that?
I mean, I think it depends on your style, right? But for me, I personally just need to understand. So, maybe I'm taking a shower and I'm like, why is this? And, the case, and if I can't answer it, then I have to go back to the user or go back to your data or something like that. But I also think it's really important to get to a point where you can put yourself in the user's shoes and almost be able to answer those questions because you've really internalized what it's like to be a user.
I see. But you're the product officer, so how can you change your mindset becoming like a regular user? Because you have to change your mindset, or
Well, I mean, I think that like I've been very lucky to work on a lot of products where I'm also a user.
Okay.
And that's both good and bad, right? The good part is I have intuitions. I know what's frustrating, things like that. Maybe the bad thing is I'm not representative of the average user. But not everybody gets to work on a product like that, and so you have to go out of your way to create the environment where you can really experience that. So, for example, when I was at Uber, I first worked on the rider side, which is easy because I'm a user. But then later I worked on the driver side, where it's hard to understand, right? And so, we would go out driving ourselves, and I did about 60 trips driving Uber, delivering food. And it's the little things, right? Like when I was delivering food in New York, for example, just like I felt, it was always kind of like stressful to find parking, get food, or talk to the doorman who doesn't like you, and things like that. And I think once you start to understand those details, you're like, okay, like this is what it feels like, and gives you more inspiration. And so I think that's really important.
I see.
To try to figure out how to get as close to the kind of emotions behind
of the users.
Yeah.
Do you think you have to like go outside of the office, and for instance, for Uber, you have to like literally drive the car or put your
I think so. And I also think that a lot of companies, after a period of time, you might actually want to hire users, who are even if they don't have the skill sets of a designer or product manager. Like sometimes it's interesting to kind of just bring that perspective in, because a lot of times, over time you start to, if you get bigger, it's very easy to get out of touch.
So let's talk about Figma again. So what kind of features do you want to add in the future? So what do you want to do with Figma?
Well, most of our customers using Figma are using Figma to build products at the end of the day. Like they're building some kind of digital product, like an app, a website, or some kind of interface that's digital. And so, in that process, there's a lot of challenges and pain points still. And when you look at the process of how does an idea become a final product, still a lot of things get lost in translation. Like going from an idea in your head to design is hard, and only some people can do that. Or going from design to code, it's so often that people will show you the mock-up in Figma and then the screen on your app, and it's very different.
It's different,
And designers might want to always include in their portfolio just the mocks, not the screenshots.
Because
screenshots not good.
Not good.
And that's a big problem, right? It's like, and it's not always that it's the engineer's fault. It could also be the designer's fault because they didn't think about the different corner edge cases and things like that. But there's clearly a problem still of like something getting lost in translation. And so one of the things that we think about are, okay, how do we actually make it easier to go from idea to final product faster, but also how do we make it so that less gets lost in translation. So that's why, for example, we've been very much focused on what's the relationship between design and code, right? How can we make the concepts closer together so that maybe designers and developers are speaking the same language, and that way it's less likely that something gets lost in translation. Or when we think about AI, like how do we actually speed up the process so that I can go from idea to product, back and forth really quickly, so that I can explore a lot of things or try a lot of things. So I think there's still so much more we can do there.
I see. Since you mentioned AI, how are you going to like implementing AI in the future? How can you use AI for your product?
Well, we think about kind of like at the highest level, we think AI has a potential to do two things. One is, lower the floor, which means, the minimum requirement for, someone to participate becomes lower, right? And that's really powerful because it's very connected to our vision of making design accessible to everyone. And even today, 2/3 of our users are actually non-designers.
Wow.
But many of them are maybe just viewing or leaving comments and stuff like that. And how can you make it easier for them to engage more deeply?
I see.
But then the other side is raise the ceiling, which is there are a lot of professional designers on our platform. How do we make them even more effective? And our hope is when you look at the design process today, there's a lot of things that are very manual labor, like, let me see what this screen looks like on iPhone, Android, website, on web, or, let me look at what if I'm making like a news website, for example, it's like, okay, like let me put in some fake content, like long article, short article, all these different cases. And all thinking through that is really important, but it's not strategic work, right? And so it's something that machine can do. And so if we can let a machine do some of the more kind of we just like rote tasks, manual labor, then designers can focus on their craft or on the strategy and explore more ideas. So we're hopeful that that's kind of what ends up happening, where more people can participate, but the best designers can do even more. Yeah.
So what will happen to the best designers? Do you think we still need them, or we only need like a few, like the best of the best?
I think that my hope is the world has so in this world there's just going to be so many more products, right?
Right.
And the reality is there's so many more problems to go and solve. And so I just think that what's going to happen is every company can build more, right, for their users and faster. And when you go to any company, they have a long roadmap of things they want to build, right?
Yes.
So I think there's no shortage of that, and it will just allow people to move faster, which I think is great. Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about team building. And you mentioned, you made an interesting point about rituals. And so could you elaborate on that? How you build a team?
I mean, I think that, the team culture is kind of like a product of its own. And one of the things that I learned was from Dharmesh, who's the CTO of HubSpot. Yeah, and he said, hey, like you actually build two things as a company, a product, but also a culture, right? And so, like how would you actually think about culture as a product and kind of design your culture, design the rituals to make it so that, your culture is what you want it to be. And I think it's very important as a leader to, think about that. And so, one of my mentors, who's the CEO of a company called Coda, has been studying this thing called rituals for a long time. And his definition of ritual is like every new employee, by the end of their first Friday, will know the company's rituals, right? It has a name and they will know it. And he's been studying a lot of different companies to just get ideas for, what are things that people do to, that are unique to their culture. Yeah.
Could you give some examples?
Yeah. For example, like a famous one might be, at Amazon, they have these 6-pagers where, you go in and at the beginning of every meeting, you actually sit down and everyone just reads for 30 minutes.
Instead of just like talking.
Exactly. Yeah.
They read it first.
Right. So that's like a very famous ritual.
Right.
Dharmesh's company, HubSpot, it was like every time the founder gives feedback, they'll put a hashtag at the end of it to say how much they're willing to die on a hill for.
Okay.
Yeah. So because the problem is that, a founder saying something, everyone will drop everything.
Right.
So if it just says hashtag FYI, it's like, okay, like I'm just saying it, don't worry about it. Versus something that's like, please do.
Yeah, it's important now.
Okay. So there's small things like that to just kind of communicate better with people, but also kind of set these standards
How about that Figma? How about your team?
I mean, we have a bunch of rituals. I mean, we also do this thing where even for a 30-minute meeting, we actually are inside FigJam for the first 10 minutes. We put on some music and a timer. And what we do is we have a lot of, we have some big questions and some what we call an alignment scale next to it, where you can put your face on agree, disagree. And so that way, by the end of the 10 minutes, where there's alignment, you don't need to spend any time. But where there's misalignment, then you spend the rest of the 20 minutes. And I think a lot of people are uncomfortable in the beginning because 30 minutes, 10 minutes silent reading, it seems like a waste of time, right? You want all 30 minutes. But actually, what you find in a meeting often is, you do spend the first 10 minutes just going through obvious things, right? So let's just understand like what the most important things are. And also, with this format, everyone has a voice, right? In a typical meeting, it's only the people who have the courage to unmute on Zoom, right? And now it's like, well, you get to see everyone's faces, and that's important too, to give everyone like an ability to express themselves.
That is a great ritual because in Japan, people are not comfortable in meetings because the senpai kohai culture, and senpai, the senior, the junior has to wait for the senpai to speak first, or the senior. So So when we have meetings, we like look at each other.
Yeah. So I think the best thing about the alignment ritual is that you can have it default hidden, so that you're not influenced by what other people say. And so, that's also scary for some people, right? But if you just make that a standard, then people start to become more comfortable. It's less about consensus.
So knowing your rituals, what are other tips to making a great team?
Yeah. Well, I think at the end of the day, it's like about, figuring out what some of your biggest values are, right? So for example, at Figma, we have 2 values that I really like. One is love your craft.
Love your craft.
And then the other is build community. And love your craft is something I really like because, craft is something like good design is something that's not always easy to put in a goal, like an OKR, right? It's
difficult to measure it.
It's hard to measure it. You can have KPIs, but not everyone believes them, and so it's important actually top down to kind of say, this is important. And one of the experiences I have is when you have a team that values it, from the beginning, everything will be well designed and well crafted. It's like, if you go into a house and everything is well designed and well organized, then you feel like you want to keep doing that, right? And it's actually easy to keep doing that because everything is, already everyone's thought about it. But if you go into a house where it's like very messy, it's very easy to just also be messy,
right?
And it just gets worse and worse over time. But like, you can only do that by people just caring, right? And so I think by saying this is actually important at the company level, it makes it easier to create that kind of environment. I think with builder community, it's like, it's both internal and external. I think one of the things that's very special about Figma is the community externally and how excited everyone is and passionate people are about Figma and what we're doing. And so, staying connected to them, really serving them is an important value. And even for my team, for example, I want people to be able to text a user and be like, hey, like, what do you think of this? And the user will give a very honest answer, right? And that kind of connection is really important because it's very easy to become, distant and not have a pulse.
So you mentioned about, it's very difficult to measure a good design. So how can you tell apart from a bad and a good design? If a house is messy, you can tell, but you have to feel it, or Yuki, you decide the good design,
Well, I think this is often, I actually think that a lot of people think design is very subjective, right? But from my perspective, maybe this is the difference between art and design. With art, I think there's more subjectivity, and there's a lot other context to consider. And I'm not an expert, but I'm sure you look at some art and you say, why is that so expensive? And,
but someone will say this is great.
Exactly.
And, different opinions.
Exactly. Right. It's kind of almost like a marketplace, right? But with design, it's really like you usually have some kind of goal, right? Like you want people to get through something very quickly, or you want people to feel less stressed, or and so I think it's really important to explain through the user's eyes each time. And there are always some small subjective things here and there, but like actually every decision, I think, is about what kind of mental model do you want users to have when they arrive? You know, how legible is it? Is the most important thing standing out? And so I think, I actually think design is more of a science, but people haven't thought about it that way. Yeah,
interesting. So as a leader, how can you, design your own team? What's the key strategy?
I mean, I think, a big thing is that I've thought has been important is finding leaders who share your values but are also very different from you, and bring a different skill set, right? And for example, I've hired people who really deeply are passionate about enterprise and billing and things like that, and that's really important, right? But at the same time, still have the same standards around what's a great experience, or care deeply about the end user experience, and so I think it's that combination of can you trust them to kind of share the same values, but then bring something new to the table.
What's the percentage between being similar and having different values?
I mean, I think that you still want to have 30-40% be the same, right?
Same.
But I also think that we are, every tech company, with such a diverse set of users. And it's so important to have a team that can represent all those different perspectives. And, I talk about putting myself in users' shoes, but maybe I'm only imagining one or two kinds of users. And we want people who have the imagination or the life context to be able to imagine other kinds of users as well.
Okay, so for the final part, let's talk about Japan, because a lot of our viewers are Japanese. So have your Japanese cultural values have influenced your thinking with design, or what do you think about Japanese culture?
I mean, I think very much so. I mean, when you look at kind of this idea of, I think a lot of Japanese businesses think about kind of the customer experience, right? Or, when you walk into, even if you walk from the airport and into a train, just every aspect of it, right? I think there's a lot of thoughtfulness throughout. I don't know, whether it's a vending machine or whether it's a convenience store, or all these things, just these daily life things, there's a lot of thought that's put into it, right? And there's a lot of pride, I think, in that. And so that's something that's very special here. That kind of sense of service.
Can you call that design? Japan's well designed because trains are not late. There's a vending machine everywhere. Is it a design or it's something rules of society?
I think it could be both, right? I definitely think that there's a little bit more of but it's kind of similar to the house metaphor earlier of okay, well, everything is orderly, so it's expected that things follow that, right?
Yes.
So I think that's kind of it's a society where that's happened. And I think that two things. So one is, I think it's very inherent in Japanese culture to be thoughtful about kind of how people feel, through the experience, and be as efficient as possible and all these things. And then the other thing is, for me personally, I think I've learned a lot about just how to be more, observant of other people, right? Because I think a lot of culture here is looking at what is happening around you, right? And that's both good and bad, right? But I think it kind of forces you to first come from a place of let me understand, and let me be more self-aware. And I think those are very important skills for a designer.
Are the Japanese Figma users different from international users, or do you see any differences?
I think, I mean, I think every market is a little bit different. I would say the Japanese designers, our community here is very studious. They want to learn, right? And I think a lot of it is because design or digital product design is still very new, very nascent, right? If you go to the US, for example, you can go to college and do a major in product design. And here, I don't think that's really the case. I think
design's still making
graphic
design,
right?
yes.
And so a lot of these product designers come from other backgrounds. Maybe they were doing graphic design. Many of them were doing engineering, you know. And so because of that, there's a desire to learn more and learn more from each other. So that's one. And then the second is, you know, they're coming together to really work together to elevate the importance of design and give each other tips to do that. Because I think with a lot of companies, you know, it's still, I think it's slowly beginning to be understood, right? But it's still the case that maybe design is a very small investment, or you know, in the U.S., for every designer, there's only 7 engineers, you know, and here you might have up to 100, right? And so, you know, I think those are areas in which it might be because there aren't enough examples there or understanding yet of why it's so strategic to, you know, invest there. Yeah.
But do you think once like the Japanese people change their mindset, because you know Japan's a country with like good design everywhere, and you go to Kyoto, you go to tea room, there's all amazing products. Do you think if we just change our mindset from like graphic design to product design, do you think we'll be able to produce more like cool products?
Possibly. I mean, I think, you know, it's interesting because I think Japan is a market in which that kind of like brand or physical design is still very huge. In many other markets, you know, that's started to become smaller and smaller. And so I think, and in other markets, what's happened is those people who, you know, care about the emotions behind designs would then apply those skills to digital. And I think here, like, because that brand and print market still is doing very well, I don't think that's fully happened yet. And so, yeah, that transformation, as well as people moving more and more of the experiences to the digital realm, is what I think will change some of like, just even the incentive structures to, you know, to learn that skill or to invest in it.
I want to ask you about your career, because our audience are more like up and coming business leaders. Any advice for those people? Because you went to Google, Microsoft, and Figma, you built an international business career. Any advice?
One is, as you think about, you know, different jobs, you know, my rule is always, you know, how do I get a role where someone else is taking a very big bet on me? Right, and that on paper I should not have that job, right? But somehow, you know, and like just hold myself to that standard. And of course, I've been very lucky to find those opportunities. But as an example, my first kind of job change from Microsoft to YouTube, you know, I was the job at YouTube was a product manager for the YouTube app on iOS, which at the time was, you know, the biggest iOS app in the world. And at the same time, I never had an iPhone.
You know? You didn't have an iPhone.
And the first day, my manager gave me a credit card and said, "Go to the Apple Store, buy an iPhone, you know, because that's your job." But you know, I think it's kind of, when I look back on it, it's like, wow, like how did my manager, you know, take a bet on me that like even though I'm not an iOS user at all, like they're willing to do that, you know? Or in this case, like with Dylan at Figma, you know, I had no background as an executive, you know, but he's still willing to take that bet. And so obviously you have to be lucky to have those opportunities, but you know, I think if you kind of say, hey, like how do you surround yourself with people who are willing to take a bet
on you?
And I think that's kind of the first thing. And I think also the other thing is joining companies that I always think about kind of like two things. One is just like, what are companies where they're really growing quickly, because when you're growing quickly, you know, your opportunities grow. But also, like, how do you join companies where even if it doesn't happen, you're still happy because you care about that mission, right? And so, you know, Figma is a good example. Is I had no idea it would be this kind of big business, but I knew that being close to design, you know, the mission of making design more accessible was one that I really cared about. So those are kind of like a few things about like career moves. And then the other one is like, I think it's very easy, especially, you know, early on in your career, to think that the people around you or the leaders around you know everything. But that's never the case, because, you know, like now I'm on the other side, and we're just the same human beings, right?
And you don't know everything.
Exactly. And we're also trying to figure it out. And so if you take that perspective and understand it, then you should be more confident when you see something that's wrong, right? To suggest something better or to try to step up and change it, right? And because as a leader, I really appreciate when someone does that, right? Maybe a design process is broken, right? And you might think that that's intentional, but it's probably because I don't have the time to think about it or I haven't really like thought deeply about it. And if you come in and like raise your hand and fix it, then that's really great.
Yeah.
You know? And so I think finding opportunities like that. Yeah.
Okay, Yuki, I think we need to wrap up. So we talked about design. Any like final comments or anything we haven't discussed?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that like, I'm really excited about the future of software and the future of design. You know, I think there's out there a lot of worry about, you know, whether AI will remove the need for those things. But, you know, at the end of the day, I kind of think that, you know, the role of the designer, someone who's really thinking about the end user, you know, is going to be even more important in a world where, you know, like AI might solve problems kind of 80% of the way, right?
Yeah.
Or they might not actually be like thinking about the end user, the emotions that we talked about, right?
Right.
Like AI is not wearing the user's shoes, right?
No.
So I think it's so much more important to be a fierce advocate of the customer, of the end user. And it's just that now you have more powerful tools to be more efficient and effective.
Do you think emotions will be more important? You have to like grasp that and what the customers are thinking about.
I think so. I mean, you know, I think there's a reality that, you know, with AI, there's more and more products that start to feel the same, you know, and it's just kind of that standard thing that's like good enough. And so, you know, in order for, you know, people to care, you know, or for a product to stand out or a business to stand out, like those emotions are going to matter. And that kind of like authenticity is going to be important. Yeah.
Okay, Yuki Yamashita, Chief Product Officer of Figma. Thank you for joining our show.
Thank you.